Adityatej, chair for this round. On panel with me, I am Adityatej. Cool. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Simple structure. Firstly, I'll give you the verdict and then I'll take you to the debate. That's about it. Verdict for this room is on a unanimous call. Closing opposition takes it first. Opening government takes a second. Closing government takes a third. And opening opposition takes a fourth. Repeating this for clarity. CO first, OG second, CG third, and OO fourth. Okay. But everybody's got the thought.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So I'll just quickly get started and take you through this. I will stop after every comparative and you can ask me questions about that comparative especially to make this a bit easier. Let's start with OG. Like, what does OG bring to this debate? OG starts with a very simple frame that this country, this Southeast Asian country, Pakistan, is likely to be in a like post-colonial resource kind of framework where state institutions are weak, where there is a kind of public mistrust in the government and that the government wants to act in the best way possible in order to ensure stability, and that there is essentially a kind of gap between people receiving resources and people putting trust in government, in that because state institutions are weak and because resources are low, people are unlikely or incentivizing this trust in the government is what is likely to ensure the stability for Pakistan. Like, they tell me that Southeast Asia looks like a land with a lot of population growth. They look like an irregular/arbitrary land division. I think that this could have like gotten a bit more explanation in terms of why this land division is so arbitrary and random. I think they give me something in order of explaining that colonial motives and colonial practices end up with land distribution being uneven and arbitrary. Thirdly, they tell me that it is likely to be out of cultural diversity, and I think that this is something that it's quite easy to take at face value that Southeast Asia is culturally diverse. I don't think this is something that a judge is likely not to know. Like, lastly, they tell me that an election won't fix everything, and the point of their case is that they want to set a proper foundation stage for the rest of the country's time. Right? They tell me that this essentially the main push is that this ensures the fairest access to democracy, in that you have the strongest democratic principle in terms of the fact that you stick to the like electoral promise essentially. I think they tell me that this 10-year period accounts for future changes in population as well. I think that this point is not really something that's pursued after this. I would have liked to see this pursued more in terms of that there is some kind of accountability mechanism for population growth in the future. Secondly, they tell me that because land division is done evenly, it is likely to be in control with zamindars and industrialists due to a couple of reasons. Firstly, that because of industrial and agricultural motives, this land is likely to be concentrated because they want to have all their industry and agriculture in the same place due to A, industrial motives, and B, colonial practices as well. Secondly, that people are likely to be squeezed into shanty towns and likely to be under the economic and technically political and democratic control of these zamindars. I think that this is also something that I would like better explanation for on why exactly these zamindars/industrialists have this kind of coercive control over these people in their like areas. Right? I think it's something that is fairly intuitive, but also would have like better mechanisms for how exactly this happens in the face of other points which say that it doesn't happen like that. Right? Thirdly, they tell me that the state is not well developed, that the real data comes with promising people rights because of the gap between resource transfer and actual resources happening in the hands of the people, plus the fact that institutions are weak. I think that they tell me that people need to have this kind of trust in the government to actually have any kind of function. Like, I think thirdly, they tell me that in terms of what happens to people in cities when they aren't actually represented, and that this is likely to lead to people having this kind of distrust in the government in terms of workers, teachers, etc., dog workers, the industrial classes in cities actually having enough incentive to even opt in the government in the first place, and the resulting is that there is likely to be bad government because these people opt out if they are not represented. Right? What does O bring into this debate? O brings out a couple of things. They tell me firstly that cities are likely to be densely populated. They tell me that these are likely to be occupied by people of the higher classes because of the higher cost of living. Right? I'm not super persuaded by this response because firstly, I think that it's quite intuitive that there are multiple kinds of people who live in cities. I don't think I can accept that only people who can pay the higher cost of living will rich people live in cities. I think there is some difference to be made there. I think this could have been explained a lot better. Right? Second, you tell me that because politicians want to be elected, they want majority approval, and therefore they are likely to cater to their particular constituency, and this leads to some kind of asymmetric representation between the constitution in a city and also between a city and a rural area. Right? Your main push is that there is bad representation because there are so many leaders in the city that, for a city specifically, I'm talking about, that there is bad representation in the city because there is a lot of red tape. I think that I would like this to be explained a lot further because it's not super persuasive in its current state. Like, entirely primary thought this is not a super persuasive point. And I think that you would have like to actually explain to me why this consensus that was happening in the first place, why in terms of other points in the debate that people are likely oneness of needs and wants while living in the same city, why this is so different that no decisions can happen at all, right? I think I would also like to speak about how your impacts, like panel agree on the whole that your impacts will be and in terms of the fact that you aren't able to clearly explain to me how this equitable development that you're talking about happens, how there is no asymmetric development on your side, etc. I think that you are really taking like a really high burden. You tell me that like agriculture will be big and famines and poverty will happen and we need to like invest into industries and manufacturing in this kind of post colonial Southeast Asian state. I think that these are like real points, but I think that this is something that needs a lot more explanation. I think the same thing occurs for the points you tell me about the decision that the government takes, that in terms of appeasement politics, in terms of bad like distrust in the city being created. I think that all these points should have been like further explained for me to actually buy these sides. So I think in this current comparative, OG takes over the whole. Any questions on this comparative specifically? Okay, fine. Now we'll introduce CG to it. I think on the CG-OG comparative, which I'll get to in a bit, I think that panel, this was like a very low margin comparative. It could have gone either way, but I'll tell you, I'll get to that in a bit. I think CG's main extension is twofold. Firstly, that they tell me, they clearly explain to me what this post-colonial state looks like in terms of the fact that it's mostly unstable, in terms of the fact that there's social/cultural/ethnic divide, and thirdly, that there are likely to be limited resources and a couple of reasons regarding this. Like they also tell me that Southeast Asia has a history of people being able to travel a lot, which means that there are likely to be very mixed like histories of people living in different areas. Like what the counterfactual for CG looks like is this. They tell me that because people cannot be shifted immediately, and this is the second part of the CG extension that we left it, that because people live in these kind of intermediate areas, politicians will therefore be incentivized, will just have to make worse decisions because there are these different ethnicities and live there. And secondly, because of the fact that they are incentivized to promote bias rhetoric to actually get elected and to actually make anything happen because they are likely to subscribe to a particular ethnic group. Right? I think that CG's harm is a lot more definitive than OG harm. That it's a worse harm than the present. I think that CG loses out to OG on the simple fact that they are just not comparative enough on what this polarization looks like in CG case itself. I think that CG spends a little too much time talking about what the counterfactual looks like in identifying real harms, but not actually talking about what the comparative burdens are in order to win over the opening side. I think in that context, I think that panel is fairly agreed that closing government is not able to prove the narrative burden that they have over their opening bench and therefore loses the opening bench. I think closing government also takes over opening opposition for the reasons I've already mentioned, that opening opposition's impacts just don't materialize and opening opposition is not able to clearly make to me what the harms are while closing government is able to do the same. Right? Introducing closing opposition into this debate, right? Closing opposition's case is very simple. They tell me that communities are likely to have strong preferences over religion, ethnicity, culture, etc. And secondly, that they have a history of fighting each other and likely to have a oneness of interest. They tell me that communities are likely to stay within their own land masses, which was a very convincing point for me that people are likely to stay within their own land masses due to the nature of what Southeast Asia looks like. I mean that certain ethnic groups are densely populated and this leads to something looking like some kind of caucus happening within people. This looks like people being able to assimilate. This looks like minorities being afraid of being assimilated and having their resources taken by majority communities. Like I think closing opposition also talks about how defending encroachment from the majority is something of a paramount incentive for these minority ethnic groups, and that they are also looking at defending their choice, which automatically fulfills the stability country. They also tell me that there's likely to be efficient lawmaking through these close ties. They also tell me that landowners and industrialists are not able to do so. They also tell me that disenfranchised people have more capacity to vote, therefore the stability metric is something that closing opposition is on. Now let's compare closing opposition to the other three benches. Right? I think panel is indeed that closing opposition takes over their opening benches because the fact that extension is far more comparative and that impact actually materializes in the debate for reasons I've already spoken. Right? I think that closing opposition takes over closing government because they are able to clearly establish that these land masses actually have people living in these constituent ethnic groups, which immediately does a lot of things to closing government's case. They're not beneficial for closing government. Secondly, I think that closing opposition is the most panel thinks that closing opposition is the most proven house in this debate. The fact that they're able to really prove their incentives and recommend for why things happen the way they do. As for opening government, I think that while opening government's principal argument works well in terms of how the democracy is good, I think closing opposition is able to take over that principle just by being able to translate their benefits better. I think that closing opposition is able to clearly identify opening government has a principle, but they don't really they just say that they care about the principle. They aren't able to clearly recognize philosophy, what are the impacts of this principle. So while this is a good principled argument to make, I don't think that it's able to go opposing opposition's arguments on like specific harms that are caused to people as a result. Like, I think that's mostly it from my side. I forgot to take questions. Sorry. But yeah, are there any questions about this specifically? Feedback. Yeah.
Response to the principle and if like the purpose of a OR is to ensure that you have some ability to control the law, and if you're not able to control the law, it's better that some amount of general preferences are at least enforced. Did the response land or how was it?
This response land. That's a key part of the reason as to why closing government opposition, despite opening government strong principle, takes over on this principle, because they're able to prove that regardless of the fact that whether like one person has one vote and just opening government principle, closing opposition's principle of ethnic preferences at least be established in government is stronger in government. Thank you for listening, and you can ask any of us.